Hello everybody. Today we're going to take a look at World War I and U.S. involvement in World War I. We're still taking a look at Wilsonian idealism and the ideals that Wilson is going to set forth, how he's going to try to hold everything up to this great standard. And then we're going to see that, well, not everything may live up to those standards, and there's limits to that. So, three things I want you to focus on today. I want you to identify the reasons for the United States involvement in World War I want you to provide evidence for a continuity in U.S. foreign policy, which means evidence that foreign policy is not changing but staying the same, and evidence for change in U.S. foreign policy during this time. So, the election in 1916, let's talk about that. Wilson's going to go for re-election in 1916. He's going to go against the Republican Charles Evans Hughes. Theodore Roosevelt is still going to be an important factor kind of in the Republican Party, but he's not going to be running. Theodore Roosevelt is going to be somebody who is going to be very pro-war. Theodore Roosevelt, he wasn't able to stay out of the Spanish-American War, so he's going to be pushing from the sidelines. He's going to want the United States to get involved with the war, and the Republicans are going to kind of take on that mantle a little bit. Wilson is going to take up the anti-war plank. Wilson's slogan in 1916, as a matter of fact, is going to be, "He kept us out of war." So what's going to happen is Wilson's going to win, showing support that Americans are not in favor of war, and he's going to win 277-254, so it's going to be a narrow electoral margin. If you take a look at the map looks a lot more Wilson than it does Hughes, but you have to remember, during this time, the states up in the north are going to be much, much more populous. There's a lot more people up there, which means that those states are going to have more votes. Now, even though Wilson in 1916 ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," very quickly after he was renominated, the United States is going to get involved with World War I. So on January 31st, 1917, the Germans announced that they would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, and that's going to cause huge tension between the U.S. and Germany because that submarine warfare, it's costing Americans money and it's costing Americans lives. Wilson also felt that he could no longer hold out and ask Congress for the authority to arm American merchant ships to defend themselves against German U-boats. Then to add further fodder to the fire, on March 1st, 1917, the Zimmermann Note was made public. The Zimmermann Note was basically a telegram from the German foreign minister to the Mexican foreign minister, basically telling Mexico that if Mexico were to attack the United States, that Germany would help Mexico regain the Mexican cession. So basically, this is exploiting some of the bad blood between the Mexican government, between the Mexicans and the United States. You have to remember, we invaded Mexico with the Pancho Villa thing. We supported Carranza against Huerta. We're arming rebels in Mexico. We're engaged in some real power politics down there under the guise of moral diplomacy. Mexicans didn't exactly favor Americans too much at this point. So Germans are trying to exploit that by getting Mexico on the side of Germany. And that way, if the Mexicans were to attack the United States, then the Germans would not have to worry about them should war come. That never did happen. The telegram is going to be intercepted because it's going to go along the transatlantic cable, so it's going to go through New York. It was encrypted, but it was decoded, and we got it. And then finally on April 2nd, 1917, because of unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. And the United States declares war on April 6, 1917. So the United States goes off to war. Now, here's what we have to understand. We are going to fight a war against a European power. This is the first time that has happened since the War of 1812. Most Americans were not enthusiastic about going into war because this war was about protecting American business interests. This war was about American shipping being destroyed. We have to remember a lot of Germans were Americans at this point, so the population is going to be very, very split. So Wilson has to come up with a way of selling the war to the American people. And he basically hires a bunch of newspapermen. They come up with some slogans. And some of the slogans they're going to be putting out is that we are fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Okay? And that World War I is going to be the war to end all wars, meaning if we do it right, if we put a plan in place after this war, then what we can do is we can effectively make it so that we won't have to worry about these horrible wars anymore. So Wilson's plan that he's going to put forward is going to be known as the 14 points, or Wilson's 14-point plan. And this is going to be a plan to ensure future peace amongst nations. He wants to create nation states, so he wants to do away with those big multinational empires and let different people have their own countries. That way there won't be the rebelliousness. We have to remember that Serbian nationalists were what started this war when they assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, because Serbians wanted Bosnian independence from Austria-Hungary. That was nationalism. So he said if we create nation states, then we won't have to worry about it. The United States entered the war because its ships were being destroyed. So Wilson said absolute freedom of the seas and war and peace. Nobody can sink any ships ever again. Then he wants to promote self-determination. He wants to promote the idea that free people can choose their own government. That is until the Soviet Union decided that they wanted communism. Then we're going to send troops to the Soviet Union, but that's another story. He also wants to establish the League of Nations. The League of Nations is essentially going to be a world government, where countries can then talk their problems out, and countries together can act against countries that decide to violate the rules. So Wilson really wants to make the world safe for democracy and make it a war to end all wars, because what he wants to do is make sure that there won't be any other way. He wants to basically have it so that after this, there's going to be a way to solve problems. And he wants to eliminate the problems that started the war in the first place. Now, at home, things are not going to be as good. So there's going to be a lot of sacrifice that has to be made in favor of this war. One thing we have to remember is there were a lot of Americans that were not in support of the war. So basically, they have to find ways to sell the war to get Americans to support it, and they also have to quiet people who are not going to support the war. So there's going to be a two-front campaign. One is going to be the Committee on Public Information, or the Creel Commission, set up by George Creel. Creel is a newspaperman, and this is going to be a propaganda campaign. It's going to be a propaganda campaign that's going to try to stir up nationalism, stir up patriotism, and get people to support the war. And then there is also going to be, so that's going to be the carrot, there's also going to be the stick. And the stick is going to come in the form of the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917-1918. Okay. So the Alien and Sedition Act, or the Espionage and Sedition Act, Espionage Act 1917, Sedition Act 1918. Basically, these make it a crime to criticize and go against the government. Sound familiar? Just like the Alien and Sedition Acts back in the 1790s with the quasi-war with France. Now, the Espionage and Sedition Act, basically, this is anti-free speech. So it's going to be brought to the Supreme Court of the United States in the case of Schneck versus the United States. This came in 1919. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, there's no way that the Supreme Court could allow this. This is a blatant violation of the First Amendment. People are expressing their right to free speech. So what if they're speaking out against the war? Well, the Supreme Court came back and they declared that because there was a clear and present danger to the United States of America made by the war, that the government had the right to restrict the freedom of speech in wartime. And this is something that we see over and over again, that our rights are restricted during wartime because the Supreme Court recognizes that during a time of war, we have to look out for the safety and security of the whole country and not just some people. So sacrifice is going to have to be made in terms of freedom of speech. People aren't going to be allowed to say what they want. Eugene V. Debs, who was the socialist candidate for president of the United States back in 1916, he's actually going to be sentenced to 10 years in jail under the Sedition Act and Espionage Acts. All right, wartime economy. So because we have to send people off to fight in the war, there's going to be a huge initiative to save food here during the war. And that's going to be led by Herbert Hoover, who's going to start to earn his chops. He's going to later become president of the United States. And basically, we're going to be saving food in order to help support the workers or help support the soldiers that are all fighting in war. Alcohol was seen as a waste, and the war is going to help the passage of the 18th Amendment, which is going to prohibit sale and consumption of alcohol. It's going to be very good for the economy, and there is going to be, and workers are going to be in a higher demand because there's going to be so many people off fighting in the war. So the War Department's going to issue the work or fight rule. Basically, if you are unemployed, if you're not working, you're automatically going to be drafted. The American Federation of Labor is going to see a huge increase. All unions are going to see huge increases, and they are going to use this to win some rights, such as effective collective bargaining in the steel industry and higher wages for their workers, because basically the industries needed the workers now more than ever, and they are going to take advantage of it. Also taking advantage of the need for workers is going to be the Great Migration. African Americans who are living in the South are going to start to move north in search of jobs. And this is because immigration is going to be cut off. African Americans are going to use this opportunity to get jobs they wouldn't have been able to have otherwise, and that is going to and that's going to help African Americans get out of the South and get better wages. Women are also going to seize on the opportunity of the war, and they're going to raise awareness to the fact that they do not have the right to vote. The National Women's Party is going to use this campaign. They're going to demand for suffrage, hunger strikes, standing in front of the White House, protesting to ensure that women have the right to vote, and they end up getting it shortly after the war. Also in 1921, women are going to get the Shepard-Toner Act, which provides for maternity and infant care for people. All right, so the war at home. We want to take a look at it. The United States is going to get involved in World War I. It's going to be the first war since the War of 1812 that we're involved with Europe, so things are going to change. There's going to be a lot of sacrifices that are going to be made at home, as we see, but we want to return back here to the questions that we dealt with. So short answer questions, so 3 points, 1, 2, 3. Identify the reasons for the U.S. involvement in the war. What is the evidence for a continuity in American foreign policy and evidence for a change in American foreign policy? There's your homework. If you have any questions, let me know. I will see you tomorrow.